in Oakland. Maybe that's the legacy of just having this stage of his life, and everybody in California says, oh, that's just Jerry, and they don't have to think about his future. So I think that was interesting to me.
James Fallows from The Atlantic. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We now go to the House of Representatives. 2 votes scheduled today on the Affordable Care Act.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 17, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Thomas Massie to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from the list submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip, limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask you to Central Advisory Staff.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for civilian defense employees at Pax River Naval Air Station, Webster Field, and the Naval Surface Warfare Center at Indian Head, all of which I represent. And Mr. Jones, who's on the floor, represents a substantial number as well in his district. Sequestration hit home last week as furloughs began. The same is true of 650,000 civilian defense workers throughout our country. The furloughs brought on by the irrational policy of sequestration are harming our national security and putting our military readiness at risk. At the same time, they also represent a severe 20% pay cut in the form of days when they are forced to stay home without pay, forbidden even from volunteering to continue performing their important task. Federal employees, including those in civilian defense positions, have already contributed $114 billion over the last 3 years for the next 7 years toward deficit reduction from pay freezes and changes in retirement benefits. These are hardworking, dedicated men and women who only want to serve their country and make a difference. As I said on this floor last week, I went to Pax River 2 weeks ago to meet with many of those preparing to be furloughed. I heard their concerns about the sequester's effect on the missions of our men and women in uniform, whom these civilian employees support. We have men and women at the point of the spear, but we have a lot of men and women who are making sure that they can be as effective and as safe as possible at the point of that spear. And I heard from them about how the sequester is affecting morale on and off base. What I did not hear much at all from those employees was concern for themselves about how furloughs will impact their own families. That's because their number one concern, even facing an undeserved 20% pay cut, is still their ability to serve and get the job done for our troops and all of us who depend on a strong national defense. After my meeting with civilian defense employees from Maryland's 5th District, I received an email message from an employee at Webster Field. He wrote this, and I quote, "We pride ourselves in not only delivering a quality product, but on being responsive to the emergent needs of our soldiers and sailors around the world." He went on to say, and I quote, "If our dedicated folks are told to turn the lights off and lock the doors at 4 p.m. on Thursday, then who will provide that level of responsiveness our military counterparts have so desperately come to expect and rely on when no one is here to respond to the call on Friday?" What message, he said, does that send to the civilians and contractors who have made it their mission to ensure our military never goes without critical equipment, data, and training they need? He goes on to say, "I genuinely worry that it devalues the level of effort that our employees have put forth. And when you're losing your pay and your work appears to be less important, it will become much harder to retain a lot of these very talented folk. Not my words, Mr. Speaker, but the words of one of America's many selfless public servants who are concerned about this dangerous sequester. What will it take for Congress to act? We've also seen air combat units grounded, and in some classes at the Naval Academy this fall could be canceled if sequester continues. The only way to reverse these effects, Mr. Speaker, on our military readiness and training is to replace the sequester with a big and balanced alternative. Budget Committee Ranking Member Chris Van Hollen has proposed a balanced alternative 7 times, but the majority has not allowed us to consider a balanced plan on this floor. If we had on this floor an alternative to the sequester that achieves real deficit reduction, which we know we need, through a balance of revenues and targeted spending cuts, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the majority of us, Republican and Democrat, would come together and would support it. It's time for Speaker Boehner to appoint budget conferees so that House and Senate negotiators can begin to reach agreement on a balanced compromise. I will continue, Mr. Speaker, to call on both parties to listen to the men and women of Pax River, of Webster Field, of Indian Head, of Quantico, the folks in North Carolina that Mr. Jones represents, folks in Maryland that I represent, the folks in Connecticut that Mr. Courtney represents, the folks in Massachusetts that my good friend, the ranking member, almost ranking member on the Rules Committee, represents, and the gentleman from Illinois represents. They and I will continue on both parties to act on a balanced, rational, reasonable alternative that brings deficit down but maintains our national security and the morale of the people who every day work to protect our great land. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I must say that it is very disappointing that the last time the House of Representatives officially remembered the men and women who have died in Afghanistan was February of this year. Since then, we've lost a total of 79 members of our armed forces. 15 were killed in March, 14 were killed in April, 22 killed in May, and 18 killed in June. Why do we continue to send our young men and women to risk their life and limb in a country that will never change? In addition to this tragic waste of life, I'm amazed at the lack of oversight of the taxpayers' money. After listening to the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction speak on the C-SPAN program, the Washington Journal on Monday, I will give you 2 examples of fraud and abuse that particularly stood out to me. We have countless buildings in Afghanistan constructed with taxpayers' dollars that remain unused or, even worse, falling apart. Mr. John Sopko, the Inspector General, referenced one building made of brick that he said is truly melting due to poor construction. How in the world can we continue to fund these programs in Afghanistan with very little oversight and, quite frankly, a waste of the taxpayers' money? Mr. Sopko further stated, we have $20 billion in the pipeline to be spent in Afghanistan while we are dealing with the ill effects of sequestration that Mr. Hoyer just spoke about, and cutting crucial programs for our military personnel right here at home, especially our mental health programs for our veterans who are suffering because of furloughing the civilian workers who help our veterans who are suffering from PTSD and TBI. Those people that are the professionals to help them are being cut. This is why this waste of money in Afghanistan is absolutely, Mr. Speaker, unacceptable. Congress is not listening to the American taxpayer. The taxpayer is fed up and tired of wasting money and life and limb in Afghanistan. History has said no nation has ever changed Afghanistan, and no nation will ever change Afghanistan. We need to listen to the American people and stop this spending, and more importantly than the spending is the waste of life in Afghanistan. I ask my colleagues on both sides to come together and work together, and let's start reducing the amount of money that we're spending in Afghanistan, and let's also reduce the number of troops that have to go back and forth to Afghanistan. Sequestration and furloughs are creating one of the worst situations for our military that they've faced in many, many years. And again, we are looking at furloughing the professional doctors and nurses and mental health providers. Mr. Speaker, beside me is really what I say speaks better than my words. It is a photograph of a full-dress Army contingency walking behind a caisson, and apparently the wife of the soldier in the caisson is standing there with her little girl holding the mother's hand, and the little girl is wondering, why is Daddy in that flag-draped coffin? That's what's missing here in Congress, quite frankly, is there is no debate on the waste of life and the waste of money in Afghanistan. I ask the American people to put pressure on members of Congress to stop this waste of life and money in Afghanistan. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will close by asking God to please bless our men and women in uniform, to please bless the families of our men and women in uniform, and His arms to hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I ask God to bless the House and Senate that we will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people. And I will ask God to please give strength and courage to the President of the United States that he will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people. And 3 times, God please, God please, God please continue to bless America, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that anyone is born with an inclination to hate. But sometimes, even in the year 2013, it's easy to forget. Not one of us begins this life hating that which is different. Not one of us begins this life fearing those who are different from ourselves. As children, we recognize differences. We wonder about them and question why. But as children, we don't hate or fear. People must learn to hate. You've got to be taught to hate and fear, carefully taught. In the second act of the great musical South Pacific, Lieutenant Joe Cable sings a song about racial prejudice entitled, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." The lyrics of the song confront prejudice at its core, explaining the simple truth that discrimination is not inherent, it's imposed. Imposed by others who once had it imposed upon them in a vicious cycle of prejudice and fear. One isn't born with an inherent aversion to those of a different skin tone. One has to be taught to fear a young, unarmed black man in a hoodie. One has to be taught to fear minorities voting. You've got to be carefully taught. I also believe discrimination plays a role in opposition to same-sex marriage. One isn't born thinking gay people should be treated differently than straight people. One has to be taught to fear equality for all. You've got to be carefully taught. Discrimination has played a role in our immigration policy from the late 19th century to today. But people aren't naturally hostile to those who speak a different language, who come from a different place. They had to be taught to fear the dreamers who are American in all but citizenship, or their parents who risk their lives to make a better life for their children. You've got to be carefully taught. When South Pacific debuted in 1949, the song "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught" almost didn't make the cut. Rodgers and Hammerstein were told the song was too controversial, too preachy, too inappropriate for the musical stage. The song was so controversial that some cities in the Deep South would not allow the musical to be played on their stages. Lawmakers in Georgia even tried to outlaw such entertainment, with one legislator arguing that a song justifying interracial marriage was implicitly a threat to the American way of life. But Rogers and Hammerstein insisted the song be sung because it told the truth. And nothing combats fear better than the truth. South Pacific premiered more than a half-century ago, yet its lessons are perhaps even more relevant today. We have come a long way since the Jim Crow era, but the truth is that discrimination, while perhaps not as blatant, is alive and well. Despite all the progress we've made, we are still taught to be fearful of differences, to discriminate against those of a different race or gender or background or sexual orientation. And we tragically, although sometimes unknowingly, allow that discrimination to influence our actions. And it's those actions, whether on a street corner in Florida or here on the House of Representatives, that teach yet another generation to hate and fear. As lawmakers, we have a responsibility to root out discrimination, to impart upon a new generation a philosophy of tolerance, and to embrace our differences. By confronting discrimination head-on, we can finally stop the vicious cycle of prejudice and fear. Nelson Mandela said it best. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. You've got to be carefully taught, Mr. Speaker, and the teaching must begin in our hearts and with our children. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in May of 2012, the House Ways and Means Committee released a report that expounds upon one of the most problematic provisions included in Obamacare, the mandate on employers with at least 50 full-time equivalent employees to offer, quote, affordable and government-approved health insurance plans to their workers beginning in 2014. Employers with at least 50 full-time equivalent employees who do not offer government-approved coverage must pay $2,000 in fines annually per employee. After 2014, the fine would be indexed to the average per capita premium for health insurance, as determined by the Health and Human Services Secretary. Well, even if employers do offer government-approved health insurance coverage, they could still be fined if Health and Human Services Secretary deems the plan unaffordable and at least one full-time employee purchases a qualified health plan through an exchange or receives a taxpayer-funded subsidy for the coverage. 71 Fortune 100 companies that responded to the Ways and Means Committee survey included in the 2012 report estimate that they could save $28.6 billion in 2014 by eliminating health insurance coverage for their 5.9 million employees and opting to pay the $2,000 annual fine per employee. Now, this would impact more than 10.2 million employees and dependents on employer-based plans. Under these estimates, from 2014 through 2023, the employer survey could save an estimated $422.4 billion. The employer mandate provides a perverse incentive for companies to drop their employees from health plans that are otherwise working and are embraced by the employees themselves. This is a stark contrast from the promise made by President Obama suggesting, quote, first of all, if you've got health insurance, you like your doctors, you like your plan, you can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan. Nobody's talking about taking that away from you, end quotes. Mr. Speaker, as we are seeing, that is simply not true. But furthermore, the employer mandate will serve to drive up the cost of Obamacare as more and more people become a part of the exchange. Even Comedy Central's Jon Stewart, in an interview with Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius this past January, posed the question as to whether or not the employee mandate would cause employers to, quote, dump employees into the exchange until it, quote, becomes sort of a backdoor of government, not a takeover necessarily, but of a government responsibility for the health care, and then suddenly, obviously then, we're Sweden. Mr. Speaker, this week the House will vote to legitimize the administration's delay of the employer mandate for 1 year. Now, while I support this delay, we must continue to focus efforts on repealing and replacing Obamacare so that we can begin to reduce the escalating health care costs and the restrictions on access, the attacks on quality and innovation in this country, and the turnover of health care from a personal decision to the government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, 18 times this year I've come to this floor and talked about the need to end hunger now. 18 times I've defended our nation's anti-hunger programs, discussed the paradox of hunger and obesity, and talked about hunger among the elderly. Over the past few weeks, this House has voted on 2 versions of the Farm Bill reauthorization. The first was defeated after the Republican leadership overreached, not only by cutting the linchpin of our anti-hunger programs, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, but also by adding poison pill after poison pill amendment to the bill. Last week, the Republican leadership responded to the stinging defeat of their Farm Bill by stripping out the entire nutrition title, while at the same time expanding subsidies for highly profitable big agribusinesses. Talk about messed up priorities, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, the nutrition title not only includes SNAP, it includes as well funding for food banks and senior anti-hunger programs. Opponents of SNAP like to focus on the idea that SNAP is somehow fraudulent. Not just that some SNAP money is being misspent, but that so much is being wasted that we need to drastically rein in the program, regardless of whether SNAP cuts increase hunger in America. We heard these claims time after time during consideration of the 2 farm bills. Sadly, those who claim rampant fraud, waste, and abuse of SNAP don't let the facts get in the way of their arguments. That's because SNAP is among the most effective and efficient, if not the most effective and efficient, federally administered program. I serve on the House Agriculture Committee, and I took part in an extensive debate over SNAP during both the committee markup and on the House floor. Not one member, Democrat or Republican, on the House Agriculture Committee provided sourced statistical information on fraud, waste, and abuse in the SNAP program. On top of that, no hearings were held on the SNAP program at all. In fact, I challenged any member of the committee to find any federal program that has a lower rate of fraud, waste, and abuse. The truth is, no one could answer my challenge. Mr. Speaker, according to both the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Office of the Inspector General at USDA, the fraud rates for SNAP are at all-time lows and are going down. On top of that, USDA continues to pursue instances of fraud, waste, and abuse and is prosecuting these cases. Despite the rapid growth in SNAP participation, primarily due to the historic economic recession we're still recovering from, the error rate for SNAP is also at a record low, according to the latest data available. Specifically, 3% of all SNAP benefits represented overpayments, meaning they either went to ineligible households or went to eligible households but in excessive amounts. This means that more than 98% of SNAP benefits were issued to eligible households, and the combined error rate, the total error rate that includes both under and overpayments, reached an all-time low in 2011, falling to 3.8%. These statistics show just how well SNAP is truly managed, but there's even more data to consider. In July, the USDA's Office of Inspector General issued a report on fraud investigations of USDA programs. It showed that fraud in SNAP is limited primarily to a few bad actors. It also showed cases of fraud are far greater in other USDA programs. According to this report, 10 cases involving USDA programs were closed in the past 2 months, and only one of them involved fraud on the part of a SNAP recipient. That's right, only 1 case in 10 had to do with an individual defrauding the SNAP program. In fact, half of those cases dealt with improper use of rural development funds. The remaining 4 cases all involved SNAP abuse by retailers, not recipients. While this may seem like an innocuous statistic, it goes to the heart of what opponents claim, that SNAP beneficiaries, poor, hungry, working Americans, are lazy and want to steal from the federal government. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could be further from the truth. SNAP provides a lifeline to hungry Americans, whether they are 1, 10, 25, 50, 75 years old or older. And in doing so, SNAP is likely the most effective and efficient program administered by the federal government. Mr. Speaker, of course we can make SNAP better. We can make anything better. We can make it more efficient. We can ensure that even more people get the food they need to prevent hunger in America. but we need to address hunger as a holistic and in a holistic and comprehensive way, including the role SNAP plays in preventing and treating hunger. This is why we need a White House conference on food and nutrition if we're going to truly reduce hunger and improve nutrition in this country. We need a plan. We need to get this right. We need some urgency and some leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, attacking SNAP and demonizing those who rely on it to make ends meet isn't just wrong, it's counterproductive. Arbitrarily cutting SNAP will only make hunger in America worse, and it certainly won't reduce the rates of fraud, waste, and abuse. The SNAP program works. While it can always be improved, we can't simply cut our way to a hunger-free society. We must work together if we're going to end hunger now. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the extraordinary life of Admiral Frank Benton Kelso II, a great American and true son of Tennessee. On Sunday, June 23rd, Tennessee's 4th Congressional District and our country lost this great American hero. To describe Admiral Kelso as honorable, principled, and dedicated would be insufficient. His achievements and individual character are matched only by his patriotism and love of country. Admiral Kelso's 79-year life included a gallant and decorated 42-year career in the United States Navy. Admiral Kelso graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1956 and began his illustrious career in the Navy by joining the nuclear submarine program, where he would later command 2 nuclear submarines. In 1986, the Admiral commanded the Atlantic Fleet, planning military actions against Libya that significantly curbed Muammar Gaddafi's terrorist activities. In 1990, he earned the position of Chief of Naval Operations, the Navy's top uniformed officer. During this time, he successfully led naval operations in the Persian Gulf War. In addition to his distinguished naval career, Admiral Kelso was a family man. He was happily married to Landis McGowan Kelso for 56 years until she passed away last year. Together, they had 4 children and 8 grandchildren. He retired from the Navy in 1994, and in 2003, he returned to his hometown of Fayetteville, Tennessee, where he would spend the last 10 years of his life. These years were filled with love for his family and friends and service to his community. I believe that there is no greater example of commitment to one's country than the life of Admiral Frank Kelso. His legacy of integrity and courage truly exemplify the best of the United States Navy. To quote the celebrated song of our Navy, "Here's wishing you a happy voyage home." I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I request permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on July 1st, the front page of the Washington Post had a headline which showed, in many respects, just, again, the disconnect between this town and the rest of the country. It said, they said the sequester would be scary. Mostly they were wrong. Well, I would like those reporters to have joined me on July 3rd, 2 days later, when I went to the Groton Navy base in southeastern Connecticut to talk to over 100 civilian DOD employees who were on the verge of being furloughed because of sequestration. Again, under sequester, 650,000 civilian DOD employees for 1 day a week for the next 11 weeks will be furloughed or lose 20% of their paycheck, despite the fact that they contribute enormous value to the military readiness of this country. Again, at that meeting, where I was joined by Captain Carl Lottie, who is the commander of the subbase, he talked about the fact that among the furloughed employees are crane operators, folks who install torpedoes, Tomahawk missiles, all of the supplies to make sure that our attack subfleet is ready to go at any given time. Again, losing them 1 day a week, again, just pushes back the readiness of the submarine fleet. I talked to Adam Pacino, who's the head of the Metal Trades Council, again, who represents the maintenance crews on the base to, again, make sure that the tip of the spear of America's Navy is ready to go. Again, losing those folks one day a week is going to slow down and retard the ability of that fleet to be ready. Rob Felice, who's the head of the NAGI force, talked about the staff that provides, again, critical services, whether it's health care, firefighter services, clerical work, to make sure that that subbase is ready and ready to accomplish its mission. Again, in every case, they all confirmed the fact that not only is this going to cause personal hardship, but it's also going to harm the military capability of that base. I received a number of emails from folks who were there that day or whose co-workers told them about that meeting. Here's what some of them said. Kimberly from Ledyard, Connecticut said, I'm a federal employee working on the Navy base in Groton. I'm a GS-5 Step 2, which means I make $17 an hour and paid biweekly. I am married with 3 children, ages 6, 4, and 1. My husband works part-time and is already capped at a salary range of $16.54 an hour. It's already hard enough to make ends meet as it is, and now with the furlough, I'm losing $226.44 every pay period. Robert from North Stonington, as a member of DOD, specifically the Department of Navy, working in Groton, I am now in the 2nd week of furloughs. As a civilian employee for the past 39 years, I have never seen our government in such disarray. My command, supervisor of shipbuilding, performs extremely important jobs of government oversight of the design, construction, and repair of our country's nuclear submarine fleet. John from Groton. Furloughs will immediately manifest itself in the local economies around every U.S. military base in the form of 20% less goods, gas, groceries being bought, and 20% less taxes being paid into town and state coffers that are already at an all-time low. And lastly, Orella from Gales Ferry, Connecticut, who said, as a result of the civilian furloughs at the Navy Branch Health Clinic, I believe our patients' access to care and continuity of quality care will be severely hampered. Our military and their dependents don't have the option to be sick or injured on a non-furlough day. Clinic staff have been trained to refer patients to urgent care facilities and emergency rooms as a last resort, largely due to the sequester. Where is the wisdom of forcing the use of higher-cost facilities in a fiscal crisis? Thank you, Orella, because it shows that, in fact, these furloughs don't really save anything structurally or long-term for the government. What's clearly needed is for Congress to respond to sequester based on what its original intention was. If you go to Phil Gramm, the granddaddy of sequestration, the Gramm-Rudman Sequester Act of 1985, which today's sequester is verbatim based on, he stated in a speech in Washington not too long ago, it was never the objective of Gramm-Rudman to trigger sequester. The objective of Gramm-Rudman was to have the threat of sequester force compromise and action. Again, that's from the inventor of sequestration. 7 times, Chris Van Hollen and the House Democratic minority has tried to get the Rules Committee to allow a vote to be taken on a measure to turn off sequester, replacing it with smarter cuts and smarter revenue to again, achieve the goal of deficit reduction, but to do it without a chainsaw that is disrupting the lives of those individuals whose stories I just described. In every single instance, the Rules Committee denied the ability of this House to vote on a common-sense measure to turn off sequester. Folks, we are now 4.5 months into sequester. Its impact extends even beyond the Department of Defense. Head Start programs, kids are losing slots. The NIH research grants are being canceled. It is time to Congress to listen to Phil Gramm, to compromise and act, to turn off sequester, and to represent these hardworking Americans who every single day are serving our nation. I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conway, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, ask you to revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 3 years ago, the Democrats told the American people that Congress had to pass the Obamacare Act so that we could learn what was in it. Well, 3 years later, we're just now learning what really is in the law and how it will cost Americans jobs and limit their health care choices. It's no surprise to me that the administration has delayed the implementation of the employer mandate. Just as every honest observer said it would, Obamacare is costing Americans full-time jobs and hourly wages as employers prepare to comply with the new mandates spawned by this law. Later today, the House of Representatives will vote to delay imposing Obamacare's crushing burdens on employers. For once, we agree with the President. This law cannot be implemented without significantly harming our economy. We will also go one step further and delay these same burdens from falling on the backs of individuals as well. I don't believe it's appropriate to protect one half of America from Obamacare, but not the other half. we will give the American families the same reprieve from this law that the Obama administration is promising to employers. The two votes we are taking today are important steps toward repeal. All of the regulations required by this law are still not written. With every day that passes, a new regulation is announced, revealing just a little more of what this bill will actually do. Each rule and regulation mandates new costs for employers, more restrictions for the insured, and ultimately hikes the cost of health insurance for American families. This law is not ready to be implemented. There are too many questions, too many inconsistencies, and too many complications. Despite the promises of the Democrat leadership, the fact is we still do not know what's in it. Mr. Speaker, my constituents want to see this law repealed. I think it's bad policy, bad politics, and terrible for health care in America. I've supported every effort to end this law, and I will continue to support these efforts as long as I am in office. Fundamentally, I do not believe that this law will ever be ready. So next year, if the President has not worked with us to delay it or replace it, we'll be back to argue for an additional delays on both the individual mandates and the employer mandates. I will continue to demand that Congress and the President repeal this law and replace it with one that puts patients first, allows new and innovative paths for care and coverage, and does not put the government between patients and their doctors. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Boy, I was going to talk about sequestration, and I will, Mr. Speaker, but I got to respond to my friend on what he calls Obamacare. It does everything he says he wants it to do, and I will remind those critics of Obamacare that the individual mandate was a Republican idea. And far from putting government between patients and their doctors, it actually facilitates patients' care directly with their doctors and their medical providers. Just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, we celebrated our nation's independence, and it reminded us of the full panoply of American history. American history, especially at the Constitutional Convention, is all about parties coming together for the common good and compromising. The first great compromise created the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, allowing proportional representation here to protect the interest of the bigger states, but equal representation in the other body to protect all of the states. That was the first great compromise. The second great compromise was between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. It involved the federal debt and the location of the future nation's capital. They had a dinner, and they compromised. Hamilton got what he wanted in the federal debt, and Jefferson got what he wanted in terms of the nation's capital. It was all about compromise. That's what we have to now remind ourselves of as we deal with the horrors of sequestration. Yes, horrors. On July 5th, the EPA, the Housing and Urban Development Department, and the IRS completely shuttered their offices throughout the United States, furloughing 115,000 employees that day. It was the third such agency shutdown for those agencies. Last week, 680,000 Department of Defense civilian employees began a one-day-a-week furlough that will continue through the end of this fiscal year. For my colleagues, who are so fond of saying, let's run government the way a business ought to be run, what business would furlough 85% of its workforce one day a week for 3 months? What CEO or chairman of the board would last one day advocating for that as a management practice? And yet, my friends on the other side of the aisle think that's perfectly fine to manage the federal government. I recently met with members of the Federal Bar Association who highlighted yet another unforeseen cost of sequestration. And that has to do with $350 million of cuts in the judicial branch. Since July of 2011, spending cuts have forced the federal court system to shed 10% of the total judicial staff through layoffs. Staffing in the court system is now at 2005 staffing levels, but the volume has only grown. Many federal courts across the nation plan now to close one day a week. Think about that. The American judicial system is looking at possibly only operating 4 days a week because of the lack of resources because of sequestration. That will result in slower processing for civil and bankruptcy cases, which will have a ripple effect on local economies for individuals and companies all across this country. Court security will be cut 30%. And we can only ask ourselves rhetorically what could go wrong with that. Probation will be affected. These cuts will undermine our ability to fulfill the Sixth Amendment right of defendants to a speedy trial and representation for the indigent. Cuts to the Federal Defender Services Program will lead to attorneys being furloughed up to 15 days for the remainder of this fiscal year. The office already is understaffed after losing 113 employees between last fall and spring as a result of budget cuts. Mr. Speaker, the Judicial Conference of the United States recently called this situation an unprecedented fiscal crisis that will seriously compromise the constitutional mission of the United States courts. That same Constitution, so many of my friends on the other side of the aisle proudly hold up and say they believe in. It's just the latest in a string of what I hope are unintended consequences from sequestration, and another reason why we must act within the next month to resolve the situation and stop mindless disinvestment in the important functions of government. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House returns at noon Eastern. Members will work on two bills related to the health care law. One that delays for a year the requirement that most employers with 50 or more employees offer health insurance or pay a penalty. And a second bill that would delay for a year the requirement that individuals buy health insurance or pay a penalty. That debate begins later on today when members return. And the House Ways and Means Subcommittee hearing this morning is looking at the delay of the employer mandate with testimony from a Treasury Department official for retirement and health policy. That hearing, underway now, is live at cspan.org. Going now, look at the White House, where we're standing by to take you